A day like no other. The airport was alive with its usual chaotic symphony. Travelers rushing past one another, announcements echoing through the halls, and the rhythmic hum of suitcase wheels rolling across polished tiles. It was a place of transitions, a hub where journeys began and ended. For 7-year-old Nia, it marked the beginning of an adventure she had been preparing for weeks. Dressed in a cheerful yellow dress with white polka dots, Nia stood at the check-in counter, her tiny figure dwarfed by the large desk in front of her. She clutched her boarding pass in one hand and her backpack in the other, a bright purple bag decorated with a rainbow patch her father had sewn on himself. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This was her first time flying alone, and it felt monumental. Her parents, Caleb and Lana, were prominent figures in the airline industry. As co-owners of one of the world's leading luxury airlines, they had seen it all, from turbulent flights to triumphant innovations. But today wasn't about them. Today was about Nia proving her independence. "Remember, sweetheart," her mother had said that morning as she knelt to adjust Nia's braids. "This is a big step, but you're brave, smart, and more than capable. If you need help, don't hesitate to ask." Her father, ever the pragmatist, had added with a playful smile, "And don't forget to observe everything. You're getting a first-hand experience of what our passengers go through. Consider it research for when you take over the family business someday." Now, standing alone at the counter, Nia felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The airline staff member at the desk, a young woman with a perfectly pressed uniform, glanced at Nia with a mix of curiosity and impatience. "Traveling alone, are we?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with skepticism. "Yes, ma'am," Nia replied, offering her boarding pass with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The woman raised an eyebrow, scanning the ticket. "First class," she murmured, almost as if to herself. Nia nodded, her voice steady. "My parents booked it for me." The woman's expression shifted briefly. Something between disbelief and disapproval flickered across her face, but she said nothing. With a perfunctory smile, she stamped the ticket and waved Nia toward security. Nia exhaled deeply as she walked toward the bustling security line. The voices of her parents replayed in her mind, grounding her. She was determined to make them proud. The security line snaked through the terminal, a seemingly endless queue of weary travelers. Nia stood patiently, her backpack resting against her legs. Her small stature made her nearly invisible among the crowd, but she didn't mind. She liked to observe people. A man in a sharp suit typed furiously on his phone, his brow furrowed. A mother juggled 2 restless toddlers while balancing a coffee cup precariously in one hand. A teenage girl scrolled through her phone, her earbuds firmly in place. First flight alone. The security agent asked as Nia finally reached the checkpoint. "Yes, sir," she replied with a polite smile. "I'm flying first class." The agent chuckled, his demeanor softening. "Well, aren't you lucky? Have a safe flight." With her boarding pass scanned and her belongings cleared, Nia entered the terminal. The sight of airplanes through the massive glass windows filled her with awe. She paused for a moment to watch one take off, its powerful engines lifting it gracefully into the sky. Her mother's stories about piloting flashed through her mind. Lana often spoke about her days as a pilot before transitioning to management, describing the thrill of takeoff and the serene beauty of flying above the clouds. At her gate, Nia approached the counter with her boarding pass in hand. The gate agent, a man with a neatly trimmed mustache, looked down at her. "Traveling alone?" he asked, his tone neutral but laced with curiosity. "Yes," she said confidently. "My parents booked this seat for me. First class." The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded and gestured toward the jet bridge. As she walked toward the plane, Nia's excitement grew. She was about to embark on her first solo flight, seated in the lap of luxury her parents had worked so hard to create. Inside the first-class cabin, Nia was greeted by a flight attendant whose professional smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome aboard," the woman said, her gaze scanning Nia from head to toe. "May I see your ticket?" Nia handed it over, her heart thudding with a mixture of pride and nervousness. The flight attendant's smile faltered briefly as she examined the ticket. "First class," she murmured, almost inaudibly. She handed the ticket back with a tight-lipped smile. "Right this way." Nia's seat was near the window, a plush chair with enough space for her to stretch her legs comfortably. She stowed her backpack under the seat in front of her and pulled out her favorite book. The cabin was a world of opulence. Polished wood accents, soft lighting, and attentive service. Nia couldn't help but marvel at it all. But as she settled into her seat, she began to notice the subtle glances from other passengers. A middle-aged woman across the aisle whispered to her companion, her eyes darting toward Nia. A man in a business suit shook his head, muttering something under his breath. Nia felt a pang of unease. She tried to focus on her book, but the weight of their gazes made it difficult. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You belong wherever you are, Nia. Never let anyone make you feel otherwise." The murmurs grew louder as more passengers boarded. Nia could feel their disapproval, though no one said anything directly to her. The flight attendant who had greeted her earlier whispered to a colleague, her eyes flicking toward Nia's seat. Nia straightened her back, determined to remain poised. When the flight attendant approached her again, her tone was polite but strained. "Sweetheart," she began, crouching slightly beside Nia's seat. "Are you sure this is your seat? May I see your boarding pass again?" Confused but compliant, Nia handed over her ticket. The flight attendant scrutinized it, as if expecting to find an error. "First class," she repeated, her voice barely masking her surprise. Before she could say anything further, a passenger seated a few rows ahead interrupted. "Are we seriously letting children fly first class now?" He scoffed. "What's next? Free upgrades for anyone who asks." Laughter rippled through a small group of passengers. Nia's cheeks flushed, but she refused to shrink under their judgment. Her father's words came to mind. "Confidence is your armor, Nia. Wear it proudly." "I'm not just anyone," she said, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "My parents bought this seat for me." The man rolled his eyes, returning to his tablet. The flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, handed the ticket back to Nia. "If you need anything, just let us know," she said before hurrying away. Nia exhaled deeply, trying to focus on her book, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. Whispers and judgmental glances continued to surround her, each one chipping away at her excitement. For the first time that day, Nia felt out of place. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. What unfolded next would change not just her flight, but the way she viewed herself, and the way others viewed her, forever. A brewing storm. The first-class cabin buzzed with quiet tension as the flight continued to board. Passengers shuffled past Nia's seat, some throwing lingering glances her way. Others avoided her altogether, though their hushed whispers were loud enough to reach her ears. She tried to focus on her book, flipping pages without truly reading them. The words blurred together as her mind fixated on the hostility around her. She leaned against the window, watching the bustle of activity on the tarmac below. Workers in reflective vests moved about, loading luggage and preparing the plane for departure. The steady hum of the engines should have been comforting, but it only served as background noise to her swirling thoughts. Maybe it's a misunderstanding, Nia thought, trying to reassure herself. Maybe they just aren't used to seeing someone like me here. The thought wasn't new to her. Nia had always been aware of the way people reacted to her family. Her parents were a testament to resilience and determination, having risen from humble beginnings to become leaders in a competitive industry. But while their success was celebrated in many circles, it also drew skepticism and envy. Nia knew this, even at her young age. Still, she couldn't understand why strangers on a plane would feel the need to judge her. Just as the last few passengers found their seats, a familiar flight attendant returned. Her expression was calm, but her movements betrayed a nervous energy. She crouched beside Nia once again, her voice low but firm. "Miss," she began, "I've been informed that there's some concern about your seat. We may need to move you to another section of the plane." Nia blinked, confused. "But this is my seat," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I showed you my ticket. My parents bought it for me." The attendant's smile was tight and forced. "I understand that, sweetheart. It's just that some passengers feel—" She paused, searching for the right words. "They feel more comfortable if we relocate you." "Comfortable," Nia repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Why would my seat make anyone uncomfortable?" The attendant didn't answer directly. Instead, she rose, gesturing for Nia to follow. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be, okay? I promise you'll still have a good flight." Nia hesitated, clutching her book tightly. Her mind raced. She thought of her parents and how proud they were of her bravery. She thought of her mother's words that morning. "You belong wherever you are." "No," she said quietly, her voice firming with resolve. "I'm not moving. This is my seat." The attendant's expression stiffened. Her tone grew sharper. "Miss, I'm asking you politely. Please follow me." "I didn't do anything wrong," Nia insisted, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. She could feel their eyes on her again, judgmental, curious, some even amused. But she didn't care. She planted herself firmly in her seat, determined to stand her ground. The scene escalated quickly. A man in a crisp business suit leaned forward from a nearby row, his face twisted in irritation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's holding up the flight. Just move her already." "She shouldn't have been here in the first place," a woman chimed in, her voice dripping with disdain. "Who lets a child fly first class alone?" Nia felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to shrink. Her small hands gripped the armrests of her seat, as if anchoring herself against a rising tide of injustice. She wanted to yell, to scream that she had every right to be here, but she knew it wouldn't help. These people had already decided who she was and where she belonged. The flight attendant stepped away briefly, returning moments later with another crew member, the senior steward. He was a tall man with a polished demeanor, his uniform immaculate. He approached Nia with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good afternoon," he said, crouching beside her. "I understand there's been some confusion about your seat." "There's no confusion," Nia replied, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "This is my seat. My parents bought it for me." The steward nodded, his expression unreadable. "I see. And your parents, are they traveling with you today?" "No," Nia said, sitting up straighter. "They're not." The steward hesitated, glancing at the murmuring passengers around them. "Well, miss, to ensure the comfort of all our passengers, we'd like to move you to a seat in the economy section." Nia's heart sank. She wanted to protest again, but the weight of the situation was becoming overwhelming. The whispers, the stares, the flight attendant's insistence, it all felt too much. For a moment, she considered giving in, just to make it all stop. But then she thought of her parents. She thought of her mother's stories about overcoming prejudice and her father's unwavering belief in doing what's right. And she knew she couldn't let them down. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I have to move?" The steward's smile faltered. He glanced around the cabin, clearly uncomfortable. "I understand how you feel, miss," he said, his tone placating. "But this is for the best." "For who?" Nia shot back. "Not for me." Before the steward could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" All heads turned to see the captain standing at the entrance to the cabin. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. The murmurs in the cabin died down immediately. The steward straightened, his posture stiff. "Captain," he began, "there's been a situation with one of our passengers." The captain's sharp gaze landed on Nia, then shifted to the steward. Is this about her seat? Yes, sir, the steward replied. Some passengers have expressed concerns, and we thought it best to. To what? The captain interrupted, his voice calm but laced with authority. Remove a paying passenger from their assigned seat because others are uncomfortable. The steward opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. The captain turned to Nia, his expression softening. Miss, may I see your boarding pass? Nia hesitated, then handed it to him. The captain examined it briefly before nodding. First class, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. This is your seat. He handed the ticket back to Nia and turned to address the rest of the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying easily over the hushed crowd. This passenger has every right to be here. If anyone has an issue with that, they are welcome to deplane and discuss it with our ground staff. A stunned silence followed his words. Nia looked around, noticing the shift in the passengers' expressions. Some looked embarrassed. Others averted their eyes entirely. The man in the business suit who had spoken earlier slumped back in his seat, muttering under his breath. The captain crouched beside Nia again. I'm sorry you've had to deal with this, he said, his voice gentle. You belong here, and I'm going to make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve. Nia nodded, unable to speak. The lump in her throat had grown too large, but this time it wasn't from fear or frustration. It was from gratitude. As the captain rose and returned to the cockpit, Nia sat a little taller in her seat. The whispers had stopped. The stares had softened. And though the sting of what had happened lingered, she felt a new sense of strength blooming within her. This wasn't over, but for now, Nia had won. The fallout begins. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the tension in the first-class cabin simmered, but did not entirely dissipate. Nia sat quietly in her seat, staring out the window as the world below gave way to an endless expanse of clouds. The captain's intervention had silenced the murmurs, but she could still feel the weight of the passengers' judgment. Some glanced her way with furtive curiosity, while others avoided looking at her altogether, their discomfort palpable. Nia turned her attention to the book in her lap, trying to immerse herself in its pages, but the words refused to settle in her mind. Her thoughts swirled, replaying the events that had unfolded. She felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride for standing her ground, gratitude for the captain's support, and a lingering sadness at how easily she had been dismissed by the crew and passengers alike. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone. Her mother's voice still rang in her ears. Call me if anything goes wrong. Nia hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to seem incapable or weak, but she also knew that what had happened wasn't something she could handle alone. Taking a deep breath, she dialed her mother's number. Hi, sweetheart. Her mother's warm voice came through the line, immediately soothing some of Nia's nerves. How's the flight so far? Mama. Nia's voice wavered as she tried to find the words. Something happened. The concern in her mother's tone was immediate. What do you mean? Are you okay? What happened? Nia explained everything. The whispers, the flight attendant's repeated questioning, the steward's insistence that she move. Her voice trembled as she recounted how some passengers had openly mocked her and how she had almost been forced to give up her seat. By the time she finished, her mother was silent for a moment, but Nia could hear her sharp intake of breath. When Celeste spoke again, her voice was calm but steely, every word laced with quiet fury. Nia, listen to me, her mother said firmly. You did nothing wrong. I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself. You have every right to be where you are. Your father and I worked hard to ensure that no one in this family would ever feel less than anyone else, and we're not going to let this slide. Do you hear me? Yes, Mama, Nia whispered, tears threatening to spill. She felt a surge of comfort and strength from her mother's words. I'm going to handle this, Celeste continued. Stay calm, keep your head high, and enjoy the rest of your flight. When you land, someone will be there to meet you. Okay, Nia said softly. I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. And remember, you belong wherever you are. Back on the ground, Celeste wasted no time. She hung up the phone and immediately called her husband, Caleb, who was in the middle of a business meeting. He answered on the second ring, his tone brisk. Celeste, everything okay? No, she replied, her voice clipped. It's Nia. Something happened on her flight. As Celeste recounted the story, Caleb's initial confusion turned to disbelief and then to outrage. They did what? He demanded, his voice rising. They tried to move her out of first class. On our airline. Yes, Celeste said, her anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. The captain intervened and put her back in her seat, but the damage is done. She was humiliated, Caleb. We can't let this go unaddressed. Caleb's jaw tightened. I'll contact the airline's director of operations immediately. This needs to be escalated. Every person involved in this incident is going to answer for it. Good, Celeste said. And I'm calling our PR team. This isn't just about Nia. It's about every passenger who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Meanwhile, in the airline's corporate offices, the news of the incident was spreading like wildfire. The director of operations, a seasoned executive named Gerald, was already on the phone with the general manager of in-flight services. This is a nightmare, Gerald said, rubbing his temples. Do you have any idea who this child is? She's the daughter of Caleb and Celeste Roberts. The general manager paled. The owners? Yes, Gerald snapped. And from what I'm hearing, she was treated like an intruder in her own company's first-class cabin. We need to address this immediately. Start by identifying every crew member involved. I want statements from all of them on my desk by the end of the day. And the passengers who complained? The general manager asked tentatively. Gerald's eyes narrowed. They don't concern me right now. Our focus is on the actions of our staff. This isn't just a PR issue. It's a violation of our core values. Handle it. Back on the plane, the captain made an announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight. Nia looked up from her book as the same flight attendant who had questioned her earlier approached with a tray of refreshments. Her smile was wider now, almost forced. Would you like something to drink, miss? She asked, her tone overly sweet. Nia shook her head politely. No, thank you. The flight attendant hesitated, as if expecting Nia to say more, but when she didn't, the woman moved on. Nia returned to her book, but her mind kept drifting back to her parents. She could picture her mother already making phone calls, her father pacing the room as he discussed the matter with the airline's executives. A small smile tugged at her lips. If there was one thing she knew, it was that her parents never backed down from a fight, especially when it involved her. As the flight continued, Nia began to feel a renewed sense of confidence. The words her mother had spoken earlier echoed in her mind. You belong wherever you are. She repeated them silently like a mantra, letting them shield her from the residual stares and whispers. She didn't know exactly what awaited her when the plane landed, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Her parents would ensure that those responsible were held accountable, not just for her sake, but for every passenger who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And for the first time since boarding the plane, Nia felt not just like a child on her first solo flight, but like a part of something bigger, a family that would fight for what was right. Ripples in the sky. As the plane soared over endless fields of clouds, Nia felt a strange mix of calm and anticipation. The rhythm of the engines hummed like a constant companion, but her mind raced with thoughts of what might unfold when she landed. Her mother's promise lingered in her thoughts. I'm going to handle this. For the remainder of the flight, the cabin remained tense but quiet. Even the whispers had ceased. It was as if the captain's public declaration had cast a blanket of discomfort over the first-class passengers who had instigated the ordeal. Nia noticed the man in the business suit, the one who had scoffed the loudest. burying himself in his tablet, refusing to meet her gaze. The woman who had complained earlier now sat rigid, her expression unreadable. The silence, though unnerving, felt like a small victory. Naya straightened in her seat, picking up her book once more. This time, the words seemed to settle, their familiar comfort wrapping around her like an old friend. Unbeknownst to Nia, the fallout from the incident had already begun to ripple far beyond the confines of the aircraft. At the airline's corporate headquarters, Celeste Roberts was in full command of the situation. Sitting in the glass-walled office she shared with her husband, Celeste was on a video call with the airline's executive leadership team. Her voice, calm but sharp, carried an edge that brooked no argument. "This isn't just about Naya," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces on the screen. "This is about every passenger who's ever been dismissed, disrespected, or treated as though they don't belong. This is a systemic issue, and it needs to be addressed immediately." One of the executives, a gray-haired man with a cautious demeanor, nodded slowly. "We've already begun an internal review," he said. "The crew on that flight has been identified, and we're conducting interviews to get a full picture of what happened." "That's not enough," Celeste replied, leaning forward. "I want actionable steps. Training programs, accountability measures, and a clear message sent to every single employee in this company that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. Our airline was built on the promise of inclusion and respect. If we can't deliver on that, what's the point?" Another executive, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude, spoke up. "I agree with Celeste. This incident has the potential to damage our reputation if it isn't handled properly. And let's not forget, this is personal. Nia isn't just any passenger. She represents the very people we're supposed to serve." Caleb, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. His voice was measured, but the underlying anger was unmistakable. "I don't care if Nia's our daughter or a stranger. She deserved better, and so does every passenger who flies with us. I want a public statement drafted by the end of the day, and I want this incident used as a catalyst for real change within the company." The executives nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Celeste ended the call, exhaling deeply. She looked over at Caleb, who was already reaching for his phone. "I'm contacting PR," he said. "This story is going to get out, and when it does, I want to be ahead of it. The narrative should be ours, not theirs." Celeste nodded. "Good, and I'll call the airport. If that crew thinks they can walk away from this unscathed, they're in for a surprise." Back on the plane, the atmosphere began to shift. A new flight attendant, a younger woman with warm eyes and a genuine smile, approached Nia with a tray of snacks. "Hi there," she said softly. "Would you like anything to eat or drink? We have cookies, juice, and sparkling water." Nia looked up, surprised by the woman's kind demeanor. "Cookies, please," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The attendant handed her a small plate with a neatly wrapped cookie and a cup of juice. "If you need anything else, just press the call button." "Okay," she said, offering a smile before walking away. For the first time since the flight began, Naya felt a glimmer of normalcy. She took a bite of the cookie, savoring the sweetness, and allowed herself to relax slightly. The clouds outside seemed brighter now, the sky a deeper shade of blue. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting our descent into the city. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today." Nia felt her heart quicken. She knew this wasn't the end of the journey, not by a long shot. She had no idea what awaited her on the ground, but she trusted her parents to fight for her. When the plane landed and taxied to the gate, Nia noticed a flurry of activity outside the window. Several airline staff members stood near the jet bridge, their expressions tense. Among them was a tall man in a suit who seemed to be waiting specifically for her. The captain himself emerged from the cockpit as passengers began gathering their belongings. He approached Nia with a kind smile. "Miss Roberts," he said, extending a hand to help her out of her seat. "It's been an honor having you aboard today. Someone very special is waiting for you at the gate." Nia nodded, taking his hand as she stood. She felt the weight of the passengers' gazes on her as she walked down the aisle. But this time, she didn't shrink. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "You belong wherever you are." As she stepped off the plane, Nia was greeted by the man in the suit. He introduced himself as Gerald, the director of operations. His expression was a mixture of apology and determination. "Miss Roberts, I'd like to personally apologize for what happened on your flight today," he said, his tone earnest. "Your parents have been informed, and we're taking immediate steps to address the situation. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let me know." Nia nodded, unsure how to respond. She felt a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion. Behind Gerald, her mother and father stood waiting, their presence commanding even in the bustling terminal. Celeste knelt to hug Nia tightly, her voice soft but firm. "You did so well, sweetheart," she said. "We're so proud of you." Caleb placed a hand on Nia's shoulder, his eyes filled with both anger and pride. "We're going to make sure this never happens again," he said. "Not to you, and not to anyone else." As they walked through the terminal, flanked by airline staff and a growing crowd of onlookers, Nia felt a deep sense of belonging. She wasn't just a little girl on her first solo flight anymore. She was part of something bigger, a family and a legacy that stood for justice, equality, and dignity. And as she stepped out into the world beyond the airport, she knew her story was far from over. Turning the tide. As Nia stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, the weight of the past few hours seemed to press down on her. The emotion she had been holding back, anger, sadness, and even pride, swirled inside her. But as soon as she saw her parents waiting near the gate, a sense of relief washed over her. Their presence was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Her mother, Celeste, immediately wrapped her in a protective embrace. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice warm but tinged with steel. "You did so well. We're going to fix this. I promise you." Caleb, her father, knelt down to her level and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. His expression was one of quiet determination. "We're so proud of you, Nia," he said. "You handled yourself like a true Roberts today. Now it's our turn." Behind her parents stood Gerald, the director of operations, along with a few other high-ranking airline executives. Gerald looked visibly nervous, his normally confident demeanor shaken by the gravity of the situation. He cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Roberts," he began, his tone formal, "on behalf of the airline, I want to extend my deepest apologies for what happened today. We've already begun an internal investigation, and I assure you, this matter is being taken very seriously." Celeste turned to face him, her posture straight and commanding. "Apologies are a start," she said coolly, "but they're not enough. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about a culture within your company, our company, that allowed this to happen in the first place." Gerald nodded, his face pale. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. We're taking immediate steps to address this." "Immediate steps," Caleb echoed, his voice calm but firm. "And what might those steps be?" "Well, for starters," Gerald said, fumbling slightly, "the crew involved has been suspended pending a full investigation. We're also mandating diversity and inclusion training for all staff, effective immediately." "That's a good start," Celeste said, her tone clipped. "But it's not enough. This isn't just about training. It's about accountability. Every employee who touched this situation, from the flight attendant to the steward, needs to understand the harm they caused. And the passengers who complained about my daughter, they need to be reminded that respect is not optional." Gerald looked down, clearly chastened. "We're prepared to issue a public statement acknowledging what happened and reaffirming our commitment to inclusivity." Celeste arched an eyebrow. "Acknowledging what happened? That sounds like damage control. I'm not interested in platitudes, Gerald. I'm interested in change. The group moved to a private conference room within the airport, where the airline's legal and PR teams had already assembled. Naya sat beside her parents, quietly observing the flurry of activity around her. Lawyers shuffled papers, executives whispered among themselves, and the head of public relations stood at the front of the room, outlining their proposed response. Our statement will emphasize the airline's commitment to inclusivity, the PR head said, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation. We'll highlight the steps we're taking to prevent similar incidents in the future, including mandatory training, internal audits, and a public apology. Celeste raised a hand, stopping the presentation mid-slide. A public apology is a given, she said, but I want more than that. I want a public acknowledgement of the systemic issues that led to this. I want a commitment to hiring more diverse staff at all levels of the company, from flight attendants to executives. And I want a passenger bill of rights that guarantees no one, especially a child, will ever be treated the way my daughter was. The room fell silent. The PR head glanced nervously at Gerald, who nodded in agreement. Consider it done, Gerald said. We'll draft the Bill of Rights immediately. While the adults strategized, Naya found herself scrolling through social media on her phone. To her surprise, the incident had already started to gain traction online. A fellow passenger had recorded part of the confrontation between Naya and the steward, and the video had been posted on multiple platforms. The comments ranged from outrage to support, with hashtags like #NayaDeservesRespect and #AirlineAccountability trending within hours. Mom, Naya said quietly, showing her mother the video. Celeste took the phone, her eyes narrowing as she watched. When the video ended, she handed it back to Naya and turned to the PR team. This changes everything, she said. The story is out there now. We're not just responding to an internal issue. We're responding to a public one. We need to get ahead of this, and we need to do it now. By the time the press conference was arranged later that evening, the story had made headlines across the country. Reporters crowded the conference room, their cameras trained on the stage where Celeste and Caleb sat beside Gerald and other executives. Naya watched from the front row, her heart pounding as her parents prepared to address the crowd. Celeste was the first to speak. Her voice was steady and strong, each word carefully chosen. What happened to my daughter today is unacceptable. As a mother, it broke my heart to see her dignity questioned. As a leader in this industry, it forced me to confront the fact that we still have a long way to go in creating a truly inclusive environment. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. But this isn't just about Naya. This is about every passenger who's ever been made to feel unwelcome, undervalued, or invisible. Today, we're taking a stand. We're implementing mandatory training for all employees, introducing a passenger bill of rights, and increasing our efforts to hire and promote diverse talent within the company. Caleb spoke next, his voice carrying a quiet authority. We built this airline on the principles of respect and equality. Today, we fell short of those principles. But this is not the end of the story. We are committed to making this right, not just for Naya, but for every person who sets foot on one of our planes. As the press conference ended, Naya felt a swell of pride. Her parents had turned her painful experience into a powerful call for change. Reporters swarmed the family as they left the stage, shouting questions about what would happen next. Naya stayed close to her mother, her small hand gripping Celeste's tightly. When they finally stepped outside into the cool night air, Naya looked up at her parents. "Did we do enough?" she asked softly. Caleb knelt down and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're just getting started," he said with a smile. "But thanks to you, we've already made a difference." Naya nodded, her heart feeling lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she belonged. And she was surrounded by people who would fight to ensure she, and everyone else, was treated with the respect they deserved. The spark of change. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind for Naya and her family. What had started as a distressing experience on a routine flight had snowballed into a national conversation about respect, inclusion, and the treatment of passengers across all airlines. News outlets ran the story on every platform, and Nea's name became a rallying cry for fairness and accountability in the travel industry. Nea watched the unfolding events with awe. She had gone from feeling powerless and humiliated in the first-class cabin to being at the center of something much bigger than herself. Yet, amidst all the noise, she struggled to process how she felt. She was proud of the way her parents had fought for her and grateful for the overwhelming support from strangers, but she couldn't shake the lingering sadness about why it had all happened in the first place. The public response. The airline wasted no time implementing the changes Celeste and Caleb had demanded. Within 48 hours, the newly drafted Passenger Bill of Rights was released to the public. The document outlined clear expectations for how all passengers, regardless of age, race, or class, would be treated with dignity and respect. It also included a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination by any employee or passenger. The company rolled out a mandatory training program for all staff, from ground crew to executives. The training focused on bias awareness, cultural sensitivity, and conflict resolution. Employees were required to complete the program within 30 days, with periodic refreshers scheduled throughout the year. In an unprecedented move, the airline also offered affected passengers an opportunity to share their experiences through a dedicated feedback portal. Nea's story had inspired other passengers to come forward with their own accounts of feeling out of place or mistreated, creating a groundswell of voices demanding change. Social media amplified the airline's efforts, but it also held the company accountable. The hashtags #Nia deserves respect and #FlyWithDignity remained trending topics for days, fueled by a growing community of advocates for better treatment in the travel industry. Celebrities, activists, and influencers weighed in, praising Nea's courage and calling for systemic change. A personal turning point. Despite the public victories, Nea found herself grappling with private doubts. One evening, as the family sat together in their living room, she finally voiced what had been troubling her. "Mama, why do people think I don't belong?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Celeste, seated beside her, reached for her hand. "Oh, sweetheart," she said gently, "sometimes people judge others based on their own fears and insecurities. It's not about you, it's about them. But that doesn't make it hurt any less." Caleb leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Nia, what you went through wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. But you stood tall. You showed courage, and you spoke up. That's how change starts. Not everyone can see the bigger picture, but you gave them a reason to look." Nia nodded slowly, digesting her parents' words. She thought about how she had felt in that moment on the plane. Angry, humiliated, but also determined. Her parents had always taught her to stand up for what was right, but now she understood the weight of those lessons in a new way. "Do you think what I did really made a difference?" she asked. Her mother smiled, brushing a stray braid from Nia's face. "Absolutely, sweetheart. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of bravery. You were brave, and because of that, the world is paying attention." The ripple effect. In the weeks that followed, the airline's actions inspired other companies to evaluate their own policies. Several competitors announced similar training programs, and industry leaders began calling for standardized guidelines to ensure equitable treatment across all airlines. Advocacy groups joined the conversation, pushing for legislative changes to protect passengers from discrimination. At the same time, Nea's story became a source of inspiration for young people around the world. Schools invited her to speak, with her parents, of course, about her experience, framing it as a lesson in resilience and the power of speaking up. Nea, shy at first, gradually grew more comfortable sharing her story. One day, after a speaking engagement at a local school, a young girl approached her. She was about Nea's age, with wide eyes and a nervous smile. "Hi," the girl said, clutching a notebook. I just wanted to say you're really brave. I'm scared to speak up sometimes, but hearing about what you did makes me think I can try." Nia's heart swelled. She knelt to the girl's level and smiled. "You can," she said. "Sometimes it's hard, but it's always worth it. And you're braver than you think." The girl beamed, and Nia felt a newfound sense of purpose. She had gone from being the girl who felt out of place in a first-class cabin to someone who could make others feel like they belonged. A new beginning. Months later, the airline held a special event to unveil its revamped policies and celebrate the changes inspired by Nia's story. The event was held at the company's headquarters, with employees, passengers, and members of the media in attendance. As a surprise, the airline dedicated one of its newest planes to Nia, naming it Courage in Flight. The plane's exterior bore a subtle inscription near the cockpit, "In honor of Nia Roberts, who reminded us all that we belong wherever we are." When Nia saw the plane, tears filled her eyes. Her parents stood beside her, their pride unmistakable. "You see that, Nia?" Caleb said, placing an arm around her shoulders. "That's your legacy." As the crowd erupted in applause, Nia felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been painful and challenging, but it had also been transformative. She had learned that standing up for herself didn't just change her life, it had the power to change the world around her. And as she looked up at the plane soaring into the sky, she knew she had found her place, not just in first class or on that flight, but in the world, a world that, thanks to her courage, was now a little more just. From adversity to advocacy. The applause from the crowd at the unveiling of the Courage in Flight plane resonated deeply with Nia. She felt a warmth in her chest, not just from the recognition, but from the realization that her experience had sparked real change. As the event wound down and attendees began to disperse, reporters swarmed Nia and her parents, eager for quotes and soundbites. "Mrs. Roberts," one reporter called out, "do you feel this incident has set a new precedent for airlines globally?" Celeste stepped forward, her posture commanding yet approachable. "I certainly hope so," she said with a smile that held both kindness and resolve. What happened to Nia highlighted an issue far bigger than one flight or one airline. This is about ensuring that every person, regardless of their age, background, or appearance, is treated with dignity and respect, not just in the skies, but everywhere. The reporter then turned to Nia, lowering her microphone to the young girl's level. "And Nia, how do you feel about all of this? You've become a symbol of courage for so many people." Nia hesitated, glancing at her parents for reassurance. Caleb gave her a small nod, and Celeste squeezed her hand gently. Taking a deep breath, Nia stepped forward. "I feel proud," she said, her voice soft but steady. "At first, it was really hard. I didn't understand why people thought I didn't belong. But my parents taught me that I do belong, and now I see that standing up for yourself can help other people too." Her words struck a chord with the crowd. Cameras flashed, and murmurs of approval rippled through the reporters. Nia's cheeks flushed, but she stood tall, feeling the surge of confidence she hadn't known she possessed. Expanding the mission. Over the next year, Nia's story continued to inspire change far beyond the airline industry. Celeste and Caleb spearheaded a new nonprofit initiative called Soar Together, aimed at promoting inclusivity and diversity in industries where bias often went unchecked. The organization partnered with schools, corporations, and advocacy groups to develop training programs and resources designed to empower individuals to speak out against discrimination. Nia became the nonprofit's youngest ambassador, often appearing at events and speaking about her experience. Though public speaking didn't come naturally to her at first, she found that sharing her story gave her a sense of purpose. Her favorite events were those held at schools, where she met children who, like her, had felt out of place at one time or another. One day, during a visit to a middle school, a teacher approached Nia and handed her a folder filled with handwritten letters from students. Each letter thanked her for her bravery and shared a personal story of overcoming challenges. "This is for you, Nia," the teacher said with a warm smile. "You've made a bigger impact than you realize." That evening, Nia sat on her bed and read through the letters, tears streaming down her cheeks. Each story of triumph and resilience filled her with pride and determination. She realized that while the ordeal on the plane had been painful, it had given her a platform to help others. And that, she decided, made it all worth it. Changing the industry. The ripple effects of the incident continued to reshape the airline industry. Under Celeste and Caleb's leadership, the airline introduced a groundbreaking initiative called Belonging in the Skies. The program included anonymous reporting channels for passengers and staff, onboard liaisons trained in conflict resolution, and an independent oversight committee to ensure the airline's policies were enforced fairly. The success of the initiative caught the attention of other airlines, many of which began adopting similar policies. Trade publications hailed it as a revolution in passenger experience, and the airline won multiple awards for its commitment to equity and inclusivity. One day, during a meeting with the airline's executive team, Celeste shared a reflection. "This company has always been about connecting people," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But now, we're not just connecting places, we're connecting hearts and minds, and that's the legacy I want us to leave behind." A flight to remember. A year after the incident, Nia found herself boarding a plane again, this time with her parents. They were flying to Washington, D.C., where Nia was scheduled to receive a national award for inspiring change through her bravery and advocacy. The first-class cabin welcomed her with smiles and congratulations from the flight crew, who treated her like the hero she had become. As the plane took off, Nia glanced out the window, watching the ground disappear below. She thought back to the girl she had been on that first solo flight, the girl who had felt small, scared, and out of place. Now, she felt different. She felt strong. She felt seen. Celeste leaned over and placed a hand on her daughter's. "You've come a long way, Nia," she said softly. "So have we," Nia replied, smiling. The flight attendant approached with a tray of refreshments. "Miss Roberts," she said warmly, "would you like anything to drink?" Nia grinned. "Juice, please." As the attendant walked away, Caleb chuckled. "You know," he said, "you might have to get used to being treated like a celebrity." Nia shrugged playfully. "I don't mind, as long as people remember why it all started." A legacy of courage. When the plane landed in Washington, Nia was greeted by a crowd of reporters and well-wishers. Flashbulbs lit up the terminal as she stepped into the spotlight once more, her parents by her side. Though she felt a familiar flutter of nerves, she reminded herself of the lessons she had learned over the past year. "You belong wherever you are." Those words had carried her through the darkest moments of her journey. They had given her the strength to stand tall, the courage to speak up, and the determination to fight for change, not just for herself, but for everyone. As Nia accepted her award later that evening, she stood at the podium and looked out at the audience. "This isn't just my story," she said, her voice clear and confident. "This is our story. And together, we can make the world a place where everyone feels like they belong." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Nia didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt empowered. She knew her journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning.